is amazing grace. This is unfailing love.
All right. Good morning, Matthew Road. This week's questions from Sunday morning services. The first one is, you talk about being ready for the return of Christ, but if the events of 2 Thessalonians are true and the Antichrist is still yet to come, then Christ can't return yet, can he? Well, I've taken the approach on all of these things that my view of eschatology is that, yes, it does seem like 2 Thessalonians emphasizes that some things must occur before the return of Christ. But I have tried to communicate pretty clearly, and I think this is true, that all of us should take the approach that we work through these biblical doctrines and think about them. But the scripture also emphasizes at the same time to constantly be vigilant and watch and pray. And so I say with that, it seems to me, yes, that the Antichrist is a precursor and the apostasy is a precursor to the return of Christ. That's what it seems to be saying. But there are some other passages that lead me to say there's a possibility that the return of Christ or the rapture or things like that are also possible. That's not my view, but I'm not so certain about these things to say anyone who holds a different view is a heretic or something like that. Or I hope that no one who thinks my views on the return of Christ being after at least part, if not the whole tribulation, to be heretical. I just reading 2 Thessalonians and some other passages, that's how I feel about it. But the scripture is clear, always be ready, always watch and pray. And the most dangerous attitude is to say, oh, I've got time to worry about the return of Christ. Now, the person who asked this question may be constantly vigilant in their walk with Christ and just saying, how do we navigate constant watching for the return of Christ with these evidence that from the scripture that looks like the Antichrist will become visible to us or known to us first. And I understand the tension there. And I think there may be a reason why the scripture leaves those things in tension for concern that people will take them and apply them in maybe some negative ways. So leaving us in the constant state of, I think these are the order of events and we should be able to see them. However, we shouldn't presume upon God and presume upon our knowledge in that regard, and so constantly be living with vigilance. What is watch and pray in context of the end times? Is it a passive attitude or kind of concrete preparations for coming persecution? That's a great question, because Jesus does say, when you see these things, head to the hills. He's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 A.D., which actually was used by the Jerusalem church to preserve that church. That they saw the coming destruction of Jerusalem, and Titus and his surrounding the city, and the church in Jerusalem read those verses and went, we're getting out of town. So it does seem like, yeah, there could be some preparatory things we could be doing. The balancing that with Jesus' statements about when he sends the 70 out in pairs, and he says, don't even take an extra coat, don't take money in your money bag, God will provide for your needs. And so we're constantly balancing those two things. I think one side is to watch and pray, and if there's obvious things we should do to prepare for the coming persecution, like how do we care for church members who might get displaced, or how do we care for the church around the world that's under direct persecution, those kinds of things we should always be asking. But in terms of our own preservation, I would just say, yeah, there may be some things we should do, but we should also live with a trusting attitude that God will provide. So there's a tough balance there between trusting in God's provision while also being wise that one of the provisions is that God lets us know in advance these things. So from my thinking is that the church should be continually using her resources in ways that helps persecuted church and the gospel to the world. That way, our resources are always directed in places that work, whether the end times are here or not. But that being said, if a person felt like, hey, here's some preparatory things I should do to get ready for maybe an ongoing persecution of the church, I would totally understand that, as long as it doesn't disconnect them completely from the culture so that ministry can't happen. I would just say that would be my provision to that, which is that some preparations make sense, but I wouldn't do it in a way that the person isn't ongoing doing good works and involved in sharing the gospel. And so those are great questions. That's always tension within the eschatology discussion, which is if we see these kinds of things coming, what are we to do preparation-wise? Are we to see these kinds of things coming occurring, or things that haven't happened yet, how are we to respond? And so there's this constant tension between I live for this day because it's the day God has given me, and I live for that day, which is the day I'll stand before Christ. And then all the days in between now and then, to not worry or have anxiety about them, but to be ever vigilant, to constantly living in a way that I'm prepared for today and I'm prepared for that day to stand before Him. And watching the Scripture to see what God might be revealing to us about the things that are unfolding in our own day. And that's a tough tension, and that's where I live my life, is in the tension between those two things in this issue of eschatology. He could come back today. My gut feel tells me from the Scripture and just reading it that we still have some events yet to unfold. But the reality is you could step off the curb tomorrow and get hit by a bus, in which case none of that matters. So we got to live today for today, and we got to live today for that day when we would stand before Him. Those are great questions, and I hold the tension that you've asked in those, and I think all of us probably feel a little bit of that tension between the now and the future. So anyway, great questions, and we'll see you guys this week.
Breaking every chain.